In this last section, I'd like to compare these four languages across a variety of different use cases. Now, language preferences and opinions can be a bit polarizing and hard to really quantify objectively. So take this here with a grain of salt. These are my personal opinions based on some past experience as well as research. So don't take it personal. Some things I might be right on, some things I might not be. But this is my own personal way of determining which language for which use case and how I would personally rank these languages. But before we get into comparing these four languages, I would like to mention some other languages that have been omitted from this comparison. Now, there are a handful of languages I would consider popular and good for getting jobs in 2021, but from a technological standpoint or workflow or productivity, I would consider either a little outdated or just not up to snuff with these other languages that we're looking at. Some of these have been around for 20 or 30 years and are still widely used today, but for new projects, I would seriously consider using something else. And as you'll see, these five that I've selected are Perl, PHP, Java, C#, .NET, and Ruby. In the case of Ruby, which is actually what the Elixir syntax is based on, I really can't think of any reasons why you'd want to use Ruby over Elixir. Basically, Elixir is sort of Ruby reimagined and built on Erlang instead of the somewhat limited inner workings of Ruby. And in the case of Java, which obviously is still used extensively throughout the world, I think Scala is probably a better option, which you'll see in the honorable mentions. My only issue with Scala is that it seems like fitting a round peg in a square hole, kind of. You're sort of adding a functional language on top of a traditional object-oriented classical inheritance type of language and VM. So it just seems like sort of a mismatch, but I know people in the Java community are quite brilliant, so I'm sure they've done a good job at making that work. But with what limited knowledge and experience I have with Scala, just doesn't seem to be as smooth from a functional perspective as something like a fundamentally functional language. Some of the honorable mentions here: Haskell, which I think is a great language to learn, but probably isn't as useful in practice. There's Nim, which I think is probably the biggest competitor to Rust, which I've looked into a little bit, but ultimately some of the memory management features of Rust led to me investing more into Rust than Nim. There's Python, which is a good general purpose language. It's increasing in popularity every year, and it's probably the best language to start with for beginners. It's also really popular with data teams and data processing. It has a great clean syntax, but ultimately under the hood, I don't think it's as good as an option as Elixir. And I think Elixir probably addresses a broader use case despite being far less popular. And finally, there's OCaml, which, to be honest, I'm probably the least experienced with, but from what I've learned, is probably actually the most noteworthy competitor to Elixir. It does take a functional approach as well. I'm not as familiar with the concurrency model there, but I do know that Facebook is heavily invested in OCaml, and it's built an extensive ecosystem around this language, but I really can't fairly comment on its strengths and weaknesses based on my limited experience with the language. But I would say that's probably the one I'd be looking to if I was looking for alternatives to Elixir. All right, so with that said, we can get into some of the use case comparison here. And again, these are largely opinion. Some of it's based off of personal experience. Some of it is based off of just fundamental understanding of the differences between these languages. Ultimately, this is how I would decide what language to use on any particular project. But obviously, there's a variety of other factors that would play into using this at an established company with an already existing staff. So this is sort of assuming greenfield development, no team, purely based on the merits of the individual language. So we'll start with the front end, building UIs and single page applications, in which case Rust and Go really don't apply. I don't think there are any options to build single page apps or UIs in Rust or Go. I'm not really sure why you'd want to do that. And obviously Node is the de facto standard here. You have React, Angular, Vue, Backbone. I mean, there's a never-ending list of frameworks that are available to build your single page app, as well as tons of tools for improving the JavaScript language, as we've touched on before. And just the fact that the web browser runs JavaScript, it's kind of tough to compete with Node/JavaScript for front-end web development. Elixir, however, is able to at least offer an alternative. And although you'll still need JavaScript, the majority of your business logic and data fetching and really the bulk of your application can be written in Elixir. So I would consider it a good option, thus the green color, but let's face it, nothing can compare to JavaScript and Node when it comes to UI, single page app development. Now moving on to backend, in this case is largely API development or multi-page MVC apps, if you think of server-based web apps. For these types of applications, I would say Rust and Go certainly are performant enough and are probably going to outperform in a lot of ways than Node and even Elixir. But for web API, they tend to be a little too rigid with the type system and just the approach to building applications. The static typing for web and API just can be too restrictive sometimes. And I know when I've tried to implement forms of polymorphism in Go, it ends up being a little hacky. And it just, for simple APIs, Go might be good, or I should say for simple domains where you don't have complex models and business rules and things of that nature. It's probably a decent option. But if you have a really complex domain and a lot of business rules, and there are things where maybe the rigidity of Rust or Go will hinder productivity, I think you'd be much better off with a dynamic language like Node or Elixir. Really, the main problem with Node is, even though there's a great community for building APIs, and you have Express, and you have Apollo, and a variety of different libraries and frameworks for building good backends and APIs, I think, again, the open-endedness of Node just creates problems on the long run when trying to keep a project consistent, scalable from a code perspective, not necessarily even like a raw performance perspective, but a code perspective, supporting large teams of developers and a large code base. I just think Node isn't well suited for that. And yeah, you bring in something like TypeScript, which helps add a type system into Node, but now you have to actually maintain that tool. TypeScript, needs to be updated regularly. It needs to work with other tools, and it just ultimately does not scale from a code-based perspective as well as something like Elixir. And with Elixir, the Phoenix framework is an excellent MVC framework for building multi-page websites and web applications. The Absinthe GraphQL library is really quite impressive and adds some additional features that you can't get in other languages with GraphQL, namely the extendable pipelines. And ultimately, Elixir is just very expressive and allows you to do a lot of the things that might be too restrictive to do in Rust or Go, or are too open-ended in Node, where there's a dozen different ways you could do it. And then finally, probably the biggest strength, I think, that gets overlooked with Elixir is the Ecto database abstraction, which is different from ORMs that you would probably use in other languages for database operations. Ecto uses the adapter pattern to really abstract away the underlying database, and so you work with it the same regardless of what data store you're using. You can write adapters for additional data stores that maybe aren't supported out of the box. And it really provides a great way to manage the abstraction between your language and the database in a consistent manner And it's really the only implementation of change sets that I've seen before, which really makes it easy to enforce changes to data before committing to the database. And that also includes database constraints as well. So Ecto is a really underrated tool in the Elixir community that, in my experience, is the best way to work with databases, especially for APIs. Now, if you're looking for max performance, or you have a lot of CPU-bound tasks, or things where you really need that low-level control and maximum performance, you really can't beat Rust. That's really what it's built for. Again, Rust introduces the concept of zero-cost abstraction, where there's really no runtime, there's no overhead, it's as low level as you can get, but also has some nice features that makes it a little bit more pleasant to work with. Go, on the other hand, provides really excellent performance and has a minimal runtime, but does still have garbage collection and abstraction for concurrency. And so there is some overhead, and it's not quite as low level. It's not zero cost abstraction like Rust. And so I'd say it's good, but it's not elite level like Rust if you're looking for max performance. And then finally, for Elixir Node, both are more high level, nodes interpreted, and really it's kind of hacky to work with the system in a node environment, and really is just not what you'd be reaching for if you need max performance. And sort of the same applies with Elixir. It's high level, it's functional, and it's built around concurrency, so there's a fair amount of overhead that just would not work well if you're looking for max performance. Now, for both of these languages, you can always create modules in something like Rust or Go and then interop with these modules in Node or Elixir for that specific module or application. But ultimately, that introduces its own problems, and it can sometimes be unsafe. So you're best off just sticking with Rust or Go if that's your concern, max performance. For CLIs, command line tools or systems programming, I think probably Go edges out Rust because you don't really need that real max performance like you do with Rust for a lot of these types of applications. And Go is going to be a little bit easier to work with and just not as hardcore as Rust, which is probably better for these types of applications. And I think that's why Go is used for both Docker and Kubernetes. And ultimately, I think both of those projects are a great fit for Go. And Rust obviously would still be a good option, but probably, again, a little overkill for these types of applications. If you don't really need that extra level of performance, then might as well use something a little easier and a little more productive. Now, for the same reasons you wouldn't use Node or Elixir for max performance type of applications or CPU-bound tasks, the same, I think, applies for CLI tools and systems programming, where you have the unnecessary runtime, which would have to be packaged in a binary. It's not really the use case that either of these languages would be appropriate for. Now, for data processing, data teams, data pipelines, which ultimately I think would be sort of similar to backend and API development as far as what would be considered a strength versus a weakness. I think Rust and Go just not expressive enough, especially when you're working with data. It's, sometimes you have to do little hacky things or things that just with a rigid static type system probably is just going to be a little too much. And a lot of times you just need to write one-off scripts as well, which I don't think Rust or Go are really suited for. Node, on the other hand, is good for scripting. It tends to be used extensively for one-off scripts at companies and also for a lot of online tools. And, like I think of AWS Lambdas, it's pretty popular, right? Lambdas in JavaScript, but I just don't think it has the right abstractions or strengths to use it extensively for data processing, especially when you compare it to more specialized tools like Python, Julia, R, or even Elixir. Elixir, on the other hand, I think is highly underrated for data. Aside from its great support for concurrency, which can be really useful for large concurrent data processing, the functional approach is highly expressive, and the language uses pipe operators extensively. It's It's really one of the most common patterns to see in Elixir, which is a very natural fit for any kind of data processing. After all, you are building pipelines. So I think it's extremely expressive and a good fit for the types of things you would do with data processing. And in addition, you also have Broadway, which is a great library and pattern for building producers and consumers, which I think really strengthens the value proposition for Elixir when it comes to data processing. And more recently, Elixir introduced NX or NIX, I'm not really sure exactly what it's called, but basically addresses one of the biggest arguments against using Elixir, and that is low-level number crunching. So this library that's been recently introduced basically adds low-level number crunching capabilities to Elixir that will perform much better than the standard library, and therefore addresses one of these weaknesses and perhaps turns it into a strength. So ultimately, I think data processing can be a huge strength for Elixir and really even be competitive with some of the more specialized languages out there that are being used specifically within data teams. Now for IoT, embedded hardware, I've broken it down to heavy and light, meaning heavy is like, all right, this is something that you're not too concerned about your binary size or that low level performance, and you're more concerned about productivity, moving quickly, and having something that will scale well versus that low level raw performance. Now, I think for heavy IoT, Elixir is the way to go because the Nerves platform really does a great job abstracting away a lot of the kind of tedious tasks of updating firmware and managing a network. It does use the distributed Erlang protocol, so every device that's on the same network can automatically discover each other and connect, and again has that expressiveness to the language that may make things really easy to work with, especially if you have a fairly complex device that does a lot of different things. This obviously comes at the cost of the Erlang VM, which can add that runtime and overhead to the binary that might not work so well in light IoT applications where you really need to squeeze out every last bit of performance. Now, Rust, I think, is probably the best option for light IoT, where you need that max performance, and that's for the same reason that we identify it as the best for CPU-bound tasks and max performance code in general. It's the most low-level, zero-cost abstraction. And you also have access to operating system threads and manual memory management, so you really can squeeze that last bit of performance out of it. For heavy IoT, it's still really good, but it's just not it's gonna be a little slower and not as productive as something like Elixir with Nerves. In the case of Go, I think in both cases, it's a good option. Probably, again, it's not gonna have that high-level productivity of Elixir. It's not gonna have that absolute max performance of Rust, but if you're somewhere in between, or you maybe have a mix of both, or you want just that happy balance between the two, Go probably is the better option. And then finally, Node, probably not good. I mean, I know there are some good platforms and frameworks out there for Node in IoT, but I don't see it having any real advantages over Elixir in this department, and it's obviously not as low level as Rust or Go. It doesn't have the same sort of system level access and control that you'd like in those languages. So in general, I wouldn't reach to Node for any IoT. I would use Elixir if overhead is not as much a concern as it is productivity, and then Rust or Go for more general cases. Now, moving out of use cases, we'll see really more the company size play a role here. What kind of companies these languages would be appropriate for. And obviously, it's going to be highly dependent on the type of product they're building and the use case. So this is definitely not one size fits all, but I would say in general, this is the rule of thumb that I would follow. And that is basically for the enterprise, large corporations that are a little conservative, need to hire large amounts of developers and engineers, and aren't as concerned about moving quickly, but want to have sort of a consistency to projects. For me, that's the perfect use case for Go and what it really excels at and what it was designed for. Google built it really for that purpose. And to me, it really is the enterprise replacement for Java. Now, Rust for the enterprise is probably going to be less desirable. It's not going to be as productive as Go, unless the enterprise is primarily like a hardware or low-level type of company that would be doing a lot of C, C++. Aside from that, I don't really see Rust being used extensively across an enterprise. And in the case of Node and Elixir, both being dynamic as well as either mixed paradigm or functional, it just doesn't fit really in the enterprise space. Again, because functional programming just is not taught as extensively and nearly as popular of an approach, there's going to be a much more limited pool of developers and engineers to hire from. And there's something about just that static typing that just fits well in the enterprise. And obviously, you're not going to really get that with Elixir or Node. On the other hand, I think startups is where Elixir really, really shines. Its broad use cases, as we've discussed, data processing, heavy IoT, web, back-end API, and potentially even front-end. It ticks a lot of the boxes and applies to a lot of the use cases that you'd see in the startup. And obviously, if your startup product is built around some very low-level applications or products or needs that top-level performance, then it's probably not going to be a fit for at least your main product. But you're still going to probably need APIs and web servers and some data pipelines, things of that nature. So I think for those parts of the startup, it's still really appropriate. And then you can use something like Rust or Go for those lower level applications. I think there's a high probability that Elixir would apply even if your main product is more low level. And again, it's just a very productive and expressive language, and really uses code generation more than any language I've seen, which can help you get things up and running quite quickly. Now, Node, which you could argue has some of the same advantages as Elixir in being dynamic, good for rapid prototyping, excellent for UI development, and really popular for web use cases. I think the problem that Node presents is its long-term value proposition. I think you could get up and running really quickly and again, prototype really rapidly, but over the long term, the language just doesn't have enough consistency or enough established patterns for you to really build large code bases, potentially with a large team of developers from a variety of different backgrounds. So it's just again too open-ended, which I think ultimately leads to problems in the long term and can be a little deceiving because you can get up and running so quickly, but ultimately you're going to be throwing away a lot of that code, rewriting things, and spending a tremendous amount of time at the organizational level trying to enforce best practices and standards and configure tools and do all these things just to wrangle in the semantics of the language that all distract from building your core product. And finally, you have Rust and Go, which again have that low-level performance, but are probably too rigid with their type systems to be as productive as you'd like to be in a startup. A lot of times in startups, you're iterating quickly, you're throwing things away, you're trying new things, and a rigid language is going to slow that pace and ultimately delay releases and progress that you really can't afford as a startup, because your biggest advantage is your ability to move quickly and be nimble. If you have a language that's a little too restrictive, you're probably going to end up moving slower than your competition and not be able to innovate as quickly as you need to remain competitive. But again, if part of your product is really low level, like if you're building a database product or some advanced hardware or doing some systems programming, then probably your core product may benefit instead from Rust or Go. But again, you're still going to have APIs, you're still going to have web, you're still going to have UIs, and these tools just aren't well suited for that kind of stuff, especially compared to something like Elixir. So finally, we have a bit of a summary down here at the bottom. So again, I've used blue as sort of elite level capabilities, green for good, yellow for okay, and red for just bad or not applicable. And it basically used a point system where elite gives you 3 points, 2 for good, 1 for okay, and none for bad. Nothing too fancy, but as you see down here, if we add everything up, we've got 13 for Rust, a 15 for Go, a 14 for Elixir, and a 7 for Node. Ultimately, Node is still and probably always will be the standard for UI development, web browser, and JavaScript, which is really never going to go away. But I really would be hesitant to use it beyond that. And again, that's mostly due to its mixed paradigm, open-endedness, the JavaScript fatigue, as they say, where you have just so many options, so many different ways of doing things that you really just spend so much more time picking tools and configuring the language and trying to standardize things that you ultimately give up productivity, and there's not really a whole lot of technical benefits you get out of it. So I think Node gets the 7 because really, personally, I think it should be limited to UI, single page app, front-end development. Now, I think Go scores the most because it really strikes a balance between familiarity, being sort of static type system, sort of object-oriented procedural type, kind of a familiar syntax, being low level, and just kind of a good choice across the board, even if it really doesn't have that raw performance of Rust or that expressiveness of Elixir. It kind of strikes that balance between the two, and therefore I think really has a wide array of use cases, which is why it scores so well. Now, Rust obviously is the no compromises, max performance option, and even though it's going to be a little bit slower productivity-wise to Go, when you need that low-level alternative to C, C++, you really can't go wrong with Rust. So I'm more specialized than Go, but really is quite amazing at what it does well. And then finally, Elixir, really the opposite of Rust. It's more high level, so it doesn't have that max performance, but really is optimized around web, API, data, heavy IoT, high levels of productivity and expressiveness at the cost of that raw, low-level performance, and even introduces a unique way to build UIs if you want to largely replace JavaScript for UI development as well. And I think unless you really need something that has that max performance or that low-level capability, Elixir pretty much can do whatever you need in your organization, do it really well, and you get to take advantage of the Erlang VM and the thought and design that went into Beam in order to scale applications really well. So again, with software, there's no real one-size-fits-all. You got to use the right tool for the job. I think Elixir is the right tool for a lot of different things you'll do, and it's quite obvious when it's not the right tool, and you can use more specialized languages for those specific cases. But overall, if you're building a startup, you want to be productive, you want to feel comfortable with the product scaling from a performance and code base standpoint, you want to be able to do a variety of different things without having to introduce 3 or 4 different languages, I really strongly believe that Elixir is the go-to, at least if you're considering something like Node or Ruby or Python. And at the very least, I think should be the first choice over Node in almost all cases, with the exception of single-page apps and UI development. And that is assuming that Phoenix Live View isn't a viable alternative.